it unleashed a 5x growth in my company because I was now doing the things that make my company work, which include just bringing out what I'm good at. And my team was doing stuff that also make my company work, but that I didn't want to do. And this seems really obvious, but I run into teams that have been around for decades and they're still not reorganized the right way. And it doesn't mean firing people necessarily, but it might mean redistributing how you do work together.
This is the Entrepreneurs United podcast with your hosts, John St. Pierre and Rich Hoffman.
Business leaders, if you have a gap between where you are in execution, in your business, in your life, at home or anywhere, today we have Dr. Lisa Hale, the CEO of Focused Leadership Consulting. Lisa, welcome to the episode.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I feel very privileged and excited to talk with you, Joe.
And so are we. Lisa, first, you've been consulting businesses for around 20 years now and helping leaders and entrepreneurs really get the most of everything that they have. What is that one secret sauce that you have learned that really helps people fix that gap between the gap and the execution itself?
Oh, it's such a great question. I would say the secret sauce is what I call radical ownership, which happens to be the name of my book coming out. And the reason that I think that is because the key principle is something both obvious and elusive for almost everybody, which is this key core understanding of exactly what is inside your locus of control and what isn't. And in fact, I heard you guys talking about leadership at home and how that relates to leadership in the workplace. And you hit on that quite a bit. You talked about the fact that when someone comes to you with a problem, most leaders jump outside their locus of control and start trying to control how the problem gets solved or try to solve it for their staff instead of staying inside their lane and really closely inside their own locus where they have agency around the questions they ask, the things they say, the thoughts they indulge, and the way that they're being. And that in turn empowers other people to exercise the fullness of their locus of control, which many of our staff miss, right? We overstep as leaders, and then our staff understeps almost as a direct physics result. It's almost a law of physics.
I was just on with a coaching client yesterday, and they had shared with me that they have an employee who they felt did not really own their role. So I'm curious to learn more about this with radical ownership, especially with what you just said, where you've got employers who may overstep control, employees who respond by understepping what's in their locus of control. How does someone go about making that shift happen so their employees do own their role?
I have always say to my clients, my leaders that I work with, that they're dual tracks that you have to be working on all at the same time. One is your internal mindset shift and doing the work to interrogate your assumptions, interrogate your thinking, and interrogate your perspective. There are lots and lots of models that I use, including some of my own, to help clients with that. But the basic fundamental idea in all of them is to not believe everything you think, check your assumptions, and explore in a really expanded way what else might be true. I have twin sons who are at Caltech, and one of them came home with 3 of his college buddies, and I took them to the airport just yesterday. So imagine this. I had 4 Caltech seniors who are all literally geniuses. That's how they got there. And we were talking about that exact thing, what it looks like to expand your model of reality so that it encompasses all of what is, instead of being upset about the fact that it doesn't look the way you think it should be.
So you had
That
said
might,
there was an internal side where you're
right,
really interrogating your assumptions, thinking, and perspective. And at
right,
the end of all that, it was really about what else might be true.
right.
And was there another side, the internal side? And then what's the other
Yeah.
piece?
Let's append to the what else might be true, but also what do you want to create to be true? Because we have tremendous agency in creation, right? So then the other track is the external side. So that's about systems. That's about creating agreements with your staff. That's about being clear on what the values and the mission and the culture are that you want to create inside your team. If you want a team that has ownership, then your role as a leader is to lead in such a way that creates the conditions for them to have ownership. Now, I believe that every leader has to decide on if you think of a big mixer, an audio mixer, they're going to have to decide on how to dial each one of those elements. But some of the elements to think about is, how tolerant are you of risk? How tolerant are you of mistakes? How do you want to deal with issues when they come up? How do you want to address accountability? How micromanaging or completely hands off do you want to be? And once a leader gets really clear about that, and maybe if this is a smart leader, they'll decide that with the rest of their team, right? And figure that out. But then once they get clear on where their place on that mixer is, or at least their range, then they start aligning their actions with that outcome.
Tell me more about a model that you use, your own or another one. What's a simple model that you can articulate that would help someone with this idea of interrogating their assumptions, thinking, and perspective?
Yeah, I love that question. So my sort of meta model is this radical ownership model. And it begins with the idea that we can't operate from a powerful place if we're stuck in fear. Fear is a natural human experience. I'm not suggesting that people should never have any, but the ability to recognize when you are coming from fear, when you're operating out of fear, and to know how to shift that quickly on the fly so that when the stakes are high or you're in an intense conversation or something's going off the rails and your system is starting to get reactive, your nervous system is starting to agitate. For women, their stomachs usually hurt and their throat closes up. And this is generalized. For men, a lot of times their chest will get tight and their blood pressure will go up. There's some physical symptoms of when you're starting to feel fear, even before you cognitively recognize it as such. And if you can attune yourself to recognize that and then choose something else. And I have always talked about choosing love instead, but that's a very philosophical concept, which I still stand by. So when I work with leaders who are really dealing with day-to-day stressful situations, which I do a lot of right now, especially in the current environment, we talk about instead, look for possibility, look for solution, look for where's the light, look for what feels less constricted. And those kinds of things have helped a lot of my leaders. So they'll think about something like, what if something different were true? What could that be? Ask questions. The first thing to do for leaders is when they start to feel fear, they want to, a lot of them will either shut down and back off and run away, or more of them will get aggressive in controlling and domineering. Either way, if their practice in that moment when they notice the fear is to ask questions, to shift into inquiry, to not take their feeling set and thought set inside of themselves so seriously, now they've opened up a whole world of possibility. And then the next piece of the model is follows from that exactly, which is to seek truth over hiding. So many staff members hide, right? Like the boss comes around and says, have you done this yet? And they'll say, oh yeah, it's almost done when they haven't started. Or leaders will go to their board and say, how are your numbers looking? Oh, they look good. Not a real board meeting, right? This will be just like a quick phone call. And then they start scrambling. Or, they'll go home to their wife or husband and they'll hear the question, how are you doing? And I'm fine. And there's a way to be present to the truth instead of hiding it and still not be dramatic about it. That really extraordinary leaders who are empowered, even in times of great change and pivot, which we are definitely in right now, when they master that presence to the truth without going drama, then they're really powerful. That's the big lever to pull. And then the final piece is that radical ownership piece, which is choosing radical ownership over blame. And the radical ownership definition is knowing both the limit of your locus of control and the extent of it. People often both overestimate the limits and underestimate the extent. And then when they get real clear on what that is for them in their environment, and then they also get really clear about what their values are, what their integrity is, then they can make choices inside that locus of control that align with their integrity and with their values and their mission and their intended vision. And it's a beautiful thing. It can take people a little while to get there, but the model is pretty simple when you see it on paper.
Yeah, and a lot of this on the internal shift, what I'm hearing is starts with recognizing when we're feeling fear. You said for women, a lot of times it's in the stomach or the throat. For men, it's in
Right,
the chest and the blood pressure. So there's
right.
a physical manifestation of that fear. The typical response is either to run away from it or dominate and control. And you're suggesting, yeah, don't do that. Sit in that moment of fear and just ask some questions instead
That's
of
right.
run away or dominate. I know you've
Yeah.
already given us a couple examples, but can you give a few more of what are some of those questions that someone should be asking? What would be 3 to 5 of those that are just great questions to ask before running away or dominating?
Yeah, for sure. So you notice the feeling and then you say, what am I afraid of right now? What's going on? What am I worried is going to happen? Or what do I think is happening? What's my story? What's my narrative? It depends on how sophisticated their modeling is around the relationship between what's true and their default thinking. But that increases over time. And by the way, I think it's worth mentioning as we go down this path that the outcome of radical ownership, that at that place, that's when we start paying attention to the external systems, the agreements, the operating system of the business, right? But this business of radical ownership is all about that internal shift. So some of those questions are definitely going to be, what am I afraid of? What am I assuming here? What am I thinking is true? And then another question, this Byron Katie has some really great protocols around this. The next question might be, is it really true? Do I know for sure that what I'm assuming here is absolutely for sure true? We don't even have to go through that if we see an out of control car coming at us and on Fifth Avenue in New York City. We don't have to question that. The fear is life saving. We jump out of the way. But everything else that's short of an immediate physical threat like that, we are basing our fear on some thinking we're doing, and we get to just neutralize the thing. So another good question might be, what else? Who do I want to be right now? That's a really powerful one. I'll tell you a personal story about this. This is where this model was born. I have 3 incredibly gifted, way smarter than me sons. And when my oldest was in 4th grade, he was already labeled as gifted in math and critical thinking, and he was struggling with long division. And he didn't want to tell anybody that because he'd been labeled as gifted, and he thought it made him a failure if he struggled with long division. So for 5 months, all the way through 4th grade, he just didn't do his math homework, and he lied to me about it and said he did it and handed it in. And then I got an email about 6 weeks before the end of 4th grade from his teacher telling me he hadn't handed in his math homework all year and that he was going to fail 4th grade. And I was so alarmed. I had literally just come in the door from work, and he was sitting at the kitchen counter drawing. And I asked him if he'd done his homework, and he said yes. And I believed him. And then I went, oh, great. And then I opened my laptop and checked my personal email. And there was this email from his teacher. Now, this next part I'm not proud of. He's 28 now, and he was whatever, 9 at the time. So this was a long time ago. And I learned a lot from this moment. I opened the laptop, I saw the email, and I turned around and I said, look at this, read this. And my voice was getting more and more strident. I was furious. I was yelling at him. I was pointing my finger. I didn't even see how terrified my child was. I was just what they call amygdala hijack. I was totally enraged. I was all red in the eyes. I can't tell you how many leaders I've coached who've been in that situation with their team and then been really embarrassed later. So that was me. And his father walked in the door, and his father was often the one losing his temper. It was usually not me, actually. So this was a really interesting turnaround moment. His father walked in the door and said, what is going on? Lisa, I want to talk to you right now. And he took me in the other room and said, what's going on? And I told him, and he said, okay, it's just math, right? So I came off the ledge. We sat down and tried to figure out a plan. But then 2 weeks later, I sat with this awesome parenting coach, and I asked her, what do you tell your parents that you work with to do when their children lie to them? And so we went on and on about that. And she said, Lisa, can we just talk about you for a minute? And of course, being a trained coach, I said, okay, what you got? And then she said she said, what do you have to give up in order to let Isaac make his mistakes and fail, and you just love him anyway?
Hmm.
Holy cow. Holy cow. And I realized in that moment that what I wasn't afraid of him failing fourth grade. I didn't actually care that much about. I wasn't excited for that, but that wasn't the end of the world. I had enough perspective at that time to know that. What I was afraid of was being a bad mom. And when leaders lose their temper or lose their calm or get scared and can't make decisions, it's not because the thing that they're dealing with is that hard. It's because they're afraid of what it means about them.
Yeah.
They're afraid that it means that they're going to be a failure or that their company isn't viable or they're a terrible leader or that they don't know what they're doing. That's usually what is at the root of that out of control leadership behavior.
Yep. Love that, Lisa. Thanks for sharing that story. We went pretty deep into, you'd said there's a dual component here. There's the internal mindset shift, and then there's the external. And Rich asked you some really valuable questions. I think Rich felt necessary to cede the microphone to me because he was going to keep going for 2 hours on.
Oh,
We're
you
gonna
guys
make
are
it
going,
talk.
oh, yeah.
Hot on this thing.
I'm withholding myself right now.
but I want to go to the external part. You said something very powerful in that external part that really connected with me. And it also ties to potentially the situation you just described with your son, but a business leader who reacts a certain way to a certain situation, which is in the external part. How do you move those dials on each of these elements? But the secret sauce in there is you should probably determine with your team how certain things are going to be handled in certain situations. I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into that because I would venture to guess that 9.9%, 9.9 out of 10 leaders do not have this very open leadership style conversation with their teams so that when situations happen, everybody knows what to expect. Instead, they just kind of react to things. So, talk to me more
Right.
about what do you mean? How would you decide with your team how the dials should be moved? What's that look like?
I love that question. I've actually been working with leaders and leadership teams for 3 decades. And for maybe the first two of them, I was convinced that I was right, that a collaborative leadership approach is the better way to go. And I do still think that works better for a certain perspective on what the outcome should be. But I've come to learn that my clients get to decide what their culture is and what their leadership style is. So that's why I say they need to figure out what that dial setting is. But here's what I see. I have a current client, small business owner, a 7-figure business. It's not really scaling to 8 figures. It's a boutique, small firm in the construction industry. So he's top of his game in his space, but not huge and a small team, right? And he's very nice as a person. And he's really compassionate as a leader in his heart. But when a mistake gets made, he absolutely loses his temper and he makes his team members cry. And he actually hired me to help him with AI, with strategizing an AI strategy so that we could put in place a blueprint for how he was going to modernize he's been in business 26 years and some of his systems are old fashioned and some of them are modern. And so we got engaged to design a blueprint for him to implement AI, which is one of the things that I do in my company. And because my heart and soul is as a leadership person, leadership expert, which is why he hired me, right? He wanted me to help him with the strategy, the vision of it. And so that's what we were working on. And every time he talked about the problems, he was talking about things that were systems. Like he would get up to go give an instruction to one of his team members verbally on a project. They have 80 projects running, and every project has at least 15 different complex elements going on, even the simplest ones. He would go and verbally shout in someone's door what they needed to do on which project. They have several projects that have similar names, and frequently, and the person's scrambling to write it down on a yellow pad because the boss just came in and barked some instructions. And they would sometimes do the thing in the wrong project, or sometimes it would get lost in the yellow pad and it wouldn't get done on time. Or sometimes it would get done and they were so freaked out by his barking that they did it badly. So then this business owner would tell me about how frustrated he was. And he thought the idea was that we would come up with systems to make that not happen. And to be sure, we did. But here I am listening to this going, your problem is a little bit in this communication style you have, because that employee doesn't take well to that. And you value that employee a lot. You've told me that so many times. So I've interviewed everybody in your firm, and there's a disconnect between the way you're communicating with your team and the way they're receiving it. So what do you want to do about that? It's that question asking thing, that putting it back on him thing that you guys talked about, actually. And so he sat there and said, okay, but I'm the boss. He should do what I tell him. And I said, yes. And I said, he's a grown ass man, though. And so are you. So can you imagine what it would feel like to you if somebody came to the door, your girlfriend, your wife, your kid, or whatever, and barked at you? Take the garbage out right now. And you're like, yeah, I wouldn't like that. So why do you think he would like that? And he started to see that his operating system, his lens around how to deal with his team was, honestly, it was informed strictly from a boss-centered lens, right? He wasn't seeing the whole system of everyone in the interaction. And actually, I have to admit, I went off down that story and forgot the exact nature of your question.
Let's lead to
Yeah.
that, which is, okay, all managers, right? The old adage is, do you manage everybody the same? Do you manage them equally? Do you manage them,
You were
and I
asking
think a
about how
lot of,
you fulfill things. Yes.
yeah, and I think a lot of times the most success I've ever had with the leadership team is when I hire Dr. Lisa Hale to come in, or I hire Mr. Rich Hoffman to come in, and we sit down as a leadership team and we discuss how this place is going to be led and how communication is going to happen. How do we
Right.
handle conflict? How do we handle accountability? How do we handle different situations? So when situations happen, the leaders all have the same vernacular, they all have the
Yeah.
same understanding of how it's going to be addressed. And then everybody's in unison and everybody understands that yelling at somebody is not really acceptable in our workplace. We've all agreed on that. But
Right.
there is accountability too, and there are repercussions of certain things. And here's how we're going to do this here at XYZ company. And we get the
Right.
whole leadership team bought in on those dials that go from left to right on accountability or situational leadership or all these different things. Everybody is on the same page versus something happens and they don't know how the leader is going to react. And then the
That's right.
leader,
They're all processing their particular programs of how they operate through the same operating system, which is really critical.
exactly.
Yeah. So I recall now, thank you for that. And what happened with this particular team is that once the boss got it, that there was something for him to shift, it wasn't just it's their fault, which is what was that metaphor? 9.9 out of 10
Yeah.
leaders
Yeah.
think that when there's a breakdown in the team dynamics or in productivity or what have you, they automatically assume that it's their team, because by and large, business owners work really hard and they know that they do. They don't think there could possibly be anything else they could do. And often what I'm helping them see is that they need to work a little less hard and shift their thinking and empower their team more. But anyway, in this particular example, that boss, once he got it, that his approach to his team was just actually not working and it was never going to work. It wasn't like continuing to use the hammer on the screw was going to get better over time. And what they needed was the entire team to get together and to talk openly about what works and what doesn't, what's effective, what's not. And then we break it down into that dashboard of elements. How are we going to communicate information to each other? How are we going to do accountability? What are going to be the consequences? How do we help each other instead of beat up on each other? How do we organize information so that it works for me who likes lists and also for me who likes to just verbally shout things out when I think of them?
And that's powerful. The ability for an organization to get with its leader and a moderator, a coach,
Yeah,
to
it's
really
really
decide, how are we going to communicate here at this organization? And how are we going to hold each other accountable to this style of communication is really powerful. And I think every company should absolutely do it. Rich, you went deep down the internal side. I went down the external side. I want to kind of go in a different direction, but before I do, I just want to come back to you and make sure that we've covered this internal, external stuff, or if you have anything else on that part.
Yeah, I appreciate that. One of the Lisa, I'm just taking note after note on the truth bombs you just continue to drop. And So many things that you're saying are deep, and I have got follow-up questions on, so I'm doing my best to be selective.
We can have a
Uh,
call time virtually.
I would love to do that. One of the things I'd like to hear more about, you just dropped out there, leaders need to work less hard, shift their thinking, and empower their team more. I would love for you to expand on that.
That's core, isn't it? I know you see that all the time. I got shown a diagram by somebody really on the fly, literally one of those napkin diagrams. And all you have to do to recreate it in your mind is take a piece of paper size, whatever size you want, and just draw two diagonal lines so that the piece of paper is in some thirds, basically. And that middle zone is like the sweet spot for action and accountability. And one side of one of the lines is going to be the overfunctioning side. And the other side, on the way other side, is the underfunctioning side. And I love this because in college, I was a physics major, an Italian major, and a history of science major. So I love all these, like the law of physics is real. I love that. And what she said is when you go outside that middle zone into overfunctioning, you have an equal and opposite reaction in the underfunctioning side in some other area of your life, which really in normal human speak, what that means is that anytime you take too much accountability or responsibility for another adult's behavior, you will always be falling short in something that you're accountable for. That's pretty huge, isn't it?
Yeah.
And most business owners and leaders I work with don't see that, but eventually they do. And so working less hard might mean literally doing less of the things that you think you have to do because no one else will do it or no one else will do it well enough. It might be having a shorter to-do list that is reduced to the things that really are the things you have to do as the owner, the leader, the buck stops here person. And empowering your team is the only way to scale. It's the only way to grow your revenue. It's the only way to keep your best people. It's actually the only way. And where most companies are stuck is right there. And I examined your book, Mr. St. Pierre, and I really loved a lot of the things you said about that very same issue, right? Scaling without soul is just sophisticated burnout was a beautiful way to put it, but it really captures the same thing. If you scale and abandon your principles, your values, your vision, your beingness, your commitments in your relationships, you're abandoning your soul and you absolutely will become burnt out. There's no possible way that it could be any other way. It's just not possible, right? Growth without clarity is a trap. That's another one I wrote down. And I love that because if you're not clear where you're going and clear how you and your team are going to go together, then your growth is going to be chaotic and you'll end up with just a hot mess that doesn't actually, it might get you short-term gains, but it's not sustainable and it will eventually implode.
Tell me about, Lisa, the leader who you share this with, who says, "Yep, I get it. The more I do, the less I'm requiring my team to do. Yep, I want more lifestyle. I'd like to be done working before 9 o'clock at night,
I was going
and
to
I'd
say,
like to stop
right?
working
Yeah.
on weekends." And
Yeah.
they say, "Yep, I get it. I want that. I see that's happening, but I'm not sure I have anybody in my business I actually trust to do the things, which is why I continue to do them." I feel like that's the number one thing that I hear back, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
That's part of why I started this AI consulting arm of what I do. I'm calling it the Freedom Edge because there are now, as of now, systems that can help leaders solve that problem when they have really small teams that are effective, but that might be missing some things. And concretely, just to be very specific, it might look like custom GPTs that I help them design and put in place that are like quality control and content control and values control and vision control around what their team does so that their teams are bringing them better and better quality product deliverables, right? So there are some concrete things to do that I help people with that really help. The other big fundamental issue is, do you have the right people on your team and do you have them in the right seats? And there are a number of ways to evaluate that. I'll just toss this out to listeners. Patrick Lencioni wrote a book, I don't know, a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, maybe two, I don't remember exactly when, called The 6 Types of Working Genius. And it has associated with it an assessment that's $25 to take. And each person on your team could do it. And then you can get a report that shows whether your team is lopsided in a certain area of work energy or if it's balanced. And if it is balanced and you've read the book, I actually recommend hiring a facilitator to facilitate through this because I think it's easier and you get more done faster. You don't have to. You can just go to the book, do the assessment with your team, and try to figure it out for yourselves. I've done this with teams and it's been really valuable. They've realized that I did it with my own team actually. And I realized I was making myself accountable to things that I hate doing and that drained me dry and kept me from doing what I really love. And my team members were doing things that they were good at, but they could have been doing some of the things that were draining me and they didn't mind doing them. And I had this background thought that I was believing that said, if I don't like it, they're not going to like it. So I should just do it. And there are some differences, I think, between how some leaders think that way and some don't. But in any event, I was thinking that way. And we sat down and we did this and we redistributed tasks. And it unleashed a 5x growth in my company because I was now doing the things that make my company work, which include just bringing out what I'm good at. And my team was doing stuff that also make my company work, but that I didn't want to do. And this seems really obvious, but I run into teams that have been around for decades and they're still not reorganized the right way. And it doesn't mean firing people necessarily, but it might mean redistributing how you do work together.
Yeah. I'll say I've been around the Lencioni material since 2016 and absolutely love it. I was a late adopter of the Working Genius, but just last year got the certification as a Working Genius facilitator and have seen it. You've got that too?
Yeah.
When did you get it? I bet it was before I did. I was a late adopter.
I got it pretty early. Yeah.
Yeah. And I have seen it absolutely transform the understanding of what's happening in meetings and why there's this push and pull.
Right.
And to speak to you on the level of the altitudes that people are speaking at. And
Right.
it's absolutely transformative. So I can completely relate with that.
It's amazing. I led a board of 14 people and we were in a turnaround situation. We had to turn around a drowning organization. And it was a lot of initiatives in a very short amount of time. And I'm very positive in nature, by nature, and very visionary and this is what we could do. That's my nature. And there were a few little interesting symptoms of that. When I showed up for board meetings, I didn't feel the need to lay out an agenda of exactly what we were going to talk about, partly because I thought it could shift in midstream, and partly because I wasn't interested in writing down like it was a contract that we would talk about this for 5 minutes and that for 12 or whatever. But my team, I had members of my team that were super in that middle section of the Working Genius model, and they needed that in order to not get lost. And I didn't like to do it. I didn't want to. So we had to figure out a way to handle that. And in that process, I learned to super appreciate the very detailed in the weeds naysayer analytics who were just like, but that won't work because of this, and that won't work because of this. And coming back to the dashboard thing that you were asking me about, John, is we agreed as a team, we did several culture resets. We agreed as a team that it was going to work better for everybody if we didn't start with that won't work, but rather with a problem I see possible that we might have to solve with that is. And then I didn't get agitated because I was like having vision shut down. And the detail folks on my team who I desperately needed didn't get shut down because they weren't being listened to. And it worked really well, but we did have to spend a little bit of time figuring that out. And once we did, we turned this organization around from literally weeks away from complete shutdown and bankruptcy to 2.5 years of runway. And it was extraordinary change.
Wow. Congratulations. Lisa, we were connected through a mutual friend, Kellen Fluckinger.
Yeah.
And you have a book coming out, Radical Ownership. I'm assuming that you've worked with Kellen a little bit on the production of that book. When does it come out? This is pretty powerful stuff you shared with us today.
We have a vague date in the summer.
Okay.
It'll be in the summer, probably July, but it's possible it'll land sooner. So what I did though, because as I was filling out your form, I recognized that if I talk about this book, I'm going to have to give people a way to find out about it. I created a landing page just for this podcast, and I have a few others that I'll be on. So I didn't put your name on it, but it was created for you guys and for your listeners.
Okay.
That is Lisa Hale, LISAHALE.co. And it just goes to a place where you get to fill out a form and you will be absolutely automatically delivered the first chapter of this book, as well as a way to get a hold of it when it's ready.
Perfect. I got a small challenge for you.
Yes.
So when I wrote my book, The $100 Million Journey, I actually put a date in and I said, you know what? Because we had an event in Austin for the Entrepreneurs United Empowerment Experience. I said, you know what? I'm going to have the book ready for that audience right there because I knew that it would fit them. If you get your book done before October 4th, we have an event in Winston-Salem with 70 entrepreneurs at the Entrepreneurs United Empowerment Experience. You should come and provide that book and talk to the audience about that book because every single leader I know has a gap between where they are and execution. And you handled so many of the topics that fit right in that gap zone of where they need to move. Really appreciate what you shared with us today. LisaHale.co. Go sign up for that first chapter. But more importantly, I can't wait for the book.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited. And I'm speaking at a huge summit in July. So I will try to have the book actually by then. So that makes it, a little. And I think those multiple deadlines is really helpful for people like me who create a lot of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing your wisdom with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You.
Stay tuned as John and Rich unpack today's conversation.
John, you can't operate from a powerful place if you're stuck in fear. I think that is so true in everything. We had Billy on, who wrote the book around courage and being courageous, and Billy Anderson. And he was back in kind of the early days. And it makes me think about, he would say fear was something that held people back from being courageous. And the antidote to it was courage. And what we heard today from Lisa was understand where you're feeling fear by tapping into your body. And then before acting next, to either run over what's in front of you and dominate it or to run, pause and ask a few questions. Is this actually true, the story that I'm telling myself about why I'm in fear? So powerful.
Rich, if you take it even a step further, probably one of the most powerful podcast conversations we've ever had. It was a best of 2023. And it gets brought up over and over again, is Shanna Francesca. And we came up with the intentional growth formula. We called it the intentional leadership growth formula, but just take leadership out of it. The intentional growth formula. Here's how you grow as a person, as a leader, as an entrepreneur, as an individual in life, anything, is be curious plus be open, in parentheses, times be respectful. We live in fear because of what we're hearing on the media. We live in fear because what we think is going on, not because we know what's going on, because we think in our own heads. We have our own narratives within our own heads. The media sometimes of our own story is off base, let alone the media on TV. And we live in fear, and it's not a powerful place to be. And I think what we are sharing there and what Lisa shared is this idea of be curious. Curiosity did not kill the cat. It's okay to question yourself. am I thinking the right narrative? It's okay to evaluate what is going on and maybe even create your own narrative by being creative and create the reality that you want to be out there. But I think way too often we just take things as fact. It's on the front page of the newspaper, therefore it must be. Somebody in the office told me that somebody didn't do their job, therefore it must be. We take too many things as fact, even the stories we tell ourselves. And so I really love that idea that we really started off with, which is what is the locus to which you're looking at your capabilities? Like, what is within your core area? I want to phrase this correctly, but it
A
was,
locus of control.
yeah, but we overvalue or we oversize our locus of control a lot of times, right? We want too much control, and therefore people don't provide enough control. We want too much control because we have fear that if we give up control, it's not going to work. And so then we live from a place of fear. We're not powerful enough and we're not curious enough to ask the right questions. So it all plays in this core understanding of what is within our locus of control and understanding.
I love that question that burnt in her mind that she was able to reiterate, that started with, what do you have to give up in order to? And in her case, it was in order to let her son try and fail and love him anyway. But I think the very beginning of that sentence is a powerful one that's worth reflecting on. What do you have to give up in order to? And the in order to is something that we desire, that for whatever reason, there's something inhibiting us. Obviously, Lisa wants to love her son. She wants to love her son through mistakes. What does she have to give up in order to do that? I think we can look at that when we look at the graph that she recommended we write out with the overfunction and underfunction. And some of that question that I asked around entrepreneurs who say, I get it. I don't trust my people in order to have them do it. I think we can look at that and go, what do you have to give up in order to equip your people to function more independently in your absence, in order to stop overperforming in your role, in order to develop more independence in your people where you can trust them? What do you have to give up? I think that may be one of the keys that I'm taking out of this that I'm going to take immediately to my coaching practice.
Yeah, this brings the power of this close down between you and I having this conversation, because I heard it, but it didn't hit me as well as it hit you. And now it just did. It took you going through it again, because you're right. The amount of entrepreneurs and leaders that, oh, I can't do that. I can't give up control over that because my people don't know how to do it, or they won't do it the same way. And that question, again, I just want to repeat it again. What do you have to give up to blank? It's such a powerful way to put it. I agree. I think it's something you should incorporate in your coaching, as should I. I think it's
John,
a great one.
in an answer to that, I just had a conversation with somebody before we hopped on this podcast where we were talking about their tendency for perfectionism
Mhm.
and how it served them 80% of the time, but 20% of the time it was actually getting in their way. Because once things weren't perfect, they just fell apart. And that would be an example of an answer that I'd imagine we might hear from some entrepreneurs is, I have to give up perfectionism. I'm going to have to give that up, that I'm really driven for everything to be just absolutely buttoned up and perfect. I'll have to give that up. And then there are obvious coaching follow-up questions around, what does that look like? And how does that work? And how will you respond when? But I just wanted to elaborate just that one more time on the type of answer. It's not, what am I going to have to give up? Oh, I have to give up this responsibility. No, this is more about, what do you have to give up that's core to who you are, that you are going to have to let go of in order for your business to grow and scale.
Yeah, but I'm going to call BS on it too. That will be their answer. But here's the answer. That's the narrative they have in their head, that everything is perfect if they do it. That's the
Right.
narrative they have in their head. They're not curious about the fact that maybe somebody could do that better than they could
Right.
if they put a little bit of time in. That's the narrative they're telling themselves. They don't have the curiosity because they're baked in fear that if I don't do it, it's not going to be. So it's that whole, you're not powerful if you're living coming from a place of fear equation backs full circle again. When you hear that answer, it's the first thing that comes to mind. Oh, everything in your business is perfect when you do it. But when
Right.
people, It's that whole narrative. And I'll tell you the one thing that I want to come back to that she said, we didn't dive enough into this. This could be a podcast in and of itself, Rich, that maybe you and I should have at some point, because we have a lot of experience in this area, is be present to the truth over hiding it without drama is a key component for leaders to master. Be present to the truth over hiding it without drama. And it brought to me conflict avoidance in the workplace, right? Just like conflict avoidance maybe in the home, or conflict avoidance with relationships. The ability to effectively and appropriately handle conflict and address it and put the flashlight in the black corner, right? And really understand what is going on, full throttle, 100% transparency, and not hide it, but also do it without drama, is something that is a skill to master.
Mic drop.